glad you're here. This is our third of three classes with Daniel on Jewish identity. I encourage you, if you missed either the first or the second, to watch the recordings, which are available on the Jewish Collaborative website and on our YouTube channel under this under the class heading. And I want to share something with you about what's coming up for the rest of the summer because it's really quite exciting. So bear with me. We're doing something unique this summer, which is that we are engaging Daniel to basically teach one of his college courses. It's our special summer series, Seminars on Jewish Thought with Rabbi Daniel Levine. We have, it's an 8-week course, but we have 9 Mondays allocated for it in case he runs out of time or the class has to be canceled. And these are some of the great scholars he'll be talking about. We're really, these are Jewish thinkers post Haskalah. So I think this is Abraham Geiger, and this is Acharia Frankel. This is really Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, and this is Joseph Soloveitchik. His class 1 will be on when did Jews enter modernity, the Haskalah. This is Moses Mendelssohn. I'm sorry, Moses Mendelssohn, Hasidim and the Baal Shem Tov, Abraham Geiger and Reform Judaism, Zacharia Frankel, and Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. These were really what conservative Judaism became in the early part of the 20th century. These were the real founders of that kind of Wissenschaft, Zionism and anti-Zionism, Jewish existentialism, and what this means for us today. So that begins on June 30th, and you can find all that on our website. Next week, I'm really excited that Itamar Harari is coming back. He was the one that really had given us sort of a deep dive into what is the World Zionist Congress. And now he's going to unpack the results of the elections, what it reveals, what it shows, what it could mean. And of course, we planned this before the current state of, really concern and chaos in Israel and in the Middle East, but I'm sure he'll be able to talk to us a little bit about that also. And then if you do visit our, if you ever want to, visit our website, you can just go to the top here and you can view all recordings of past ALI programs here. It says click here, and then you can sort of see, what's coming up. And I will say that, many of you are donors to make this program possible. If you're not, but you appreciate it and would like to be, everything's a volunteer gift, and it makes us possible to hire amazing people like Daniel to do these classes for us. Nothing's required. Always know that you're always welcome, but we certainly appreciate your generosity. And without further ado, I will turn the class over to Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm excited for class number 3. Marsha, I'm very impressed by the ability to locate all the different characters and faces. I'm very bad with faces. So I was looking at all those different figures and I know I've seen those pictures before, but I forgot who is who and everything like that. Before we start, just to reiterate what Marsha said, which is we are obviously dealing with a very difficult time right now in Israel. So any of the studying we will do is, in honor of everybody being safe and everything there. It's very scary what's been happening. I don't know if people have been checking the news, but it's still an ongoing situation. And so even though we're going to have to sort of, bifurcate this a little bit in our mind, because we're going to be talking about Israel a lot today, in ways that might even be somewhat critical, because we're going to talk about how this contemporary debate about Jewish identity ends up having political repercussions, obviously, after 1948 with the founding of the State of Israel. And at the same time, we're obviously keeping the people and State of Israel in our mind for the safety of everybody there. So I want to just briefly summarize the first 2 classes, because I know that it's been a couple week break. So thank you for bearing with me with the scheduling changes. And hopefully the last 2 classes will really set up this class to be a little bit more conversational. We'll talk a little bit about some interesting Supreme Court cases that have happened in Israel over the last 60, 70 years. But really, I think this is going to be more conversational, because obviously the question of who is a Jew right? If I was just to boil down this entire series onto one foot, the answer would obviously be it depends, right? Hopefully now, and I don't think anybody's surprised by that answer, but hopefully the journey has been interesting. So starting with the first class, we looked at ancient Israel debates within the Tanakh. We compared the book of Ezra and Nehemiah to the book of Ruth. And these two books gave completely different, conflicting conceptions of Jewish identity that really, I argued, have been in tension with each other throughout our entire history. So just a reminder, Ezra and Nehemiah, generally, historians view they come first in the history. Ezra leads the Jewish people back after King Cyrus allows a return to Jerusalem in the Second Temple. And Ezra declares that there have been too many people who have taken foreign wives during Israel's 70-year stint in Babylonia. And so Israel needs to send away all foreign wives because we need to protect what Ezra calls the Zerah HaKadosh, right? The holy seed. This is the only time in the Tanakh that this phrase is used. And most people take this, both classic Jewish commentators and academic commentators take this to mean that Ezra's conception of Jewishness was something that, again, this was obviously before anybody knew about, genetics or what we might call, hereditary genes, but some spiritual genetic sense of what it means to be Jewish, where actually having the holy seed of Jewish identity for Ezra was important. What Ezra never mentions, which is interesting because it conflicts with the vast majority of our experience reading through the rest of the Tanakh, is conversion. Now, just to take one more step back, I think I mentioned this in class number 1, but just to reiterate, one of the most interesting things you get when you open the Tanakh and just read through the stories is that every single great figure in the Tanakh, right? I'm talking about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, King David, King Solomon, right? We can probably name 20 others. They all married quote unquote non-Israelite women, right? It's not as if, Moses went and met a nice Israelite slave woman and married her, right? He specifically travels out of town to the middle of nowhere and ends up meeting this guy Yitro, and right, we know the story, right? The exact same thing happens with many other figures. And in the early period of the Tanakh, this is seen as just not a contradiction, because what most scholars circle around is this idea that marrying into the Israelite community was sufficient to just become Israelite, right? This is very much a tribal definition of if you marry in and you just adopt the norms of the tribe, right? What we might call today conversion, then you just become Israelite. Ezra, for a whole variety of reasons that we got to in class 1, did not like this idea. And so he rails against this, starting a multi-thousand-year tradition of certain facets of Jewish thought viewing something inherently, I'll call it ethnic or genetic or something within Jewishness. So the most radical formulation of this, just to completely summarize class number 1, was Judah Halevi in the 12th century in Spain in his magnum opus, the Kuzari, where he sets up this fictional dialogue between a non-Jewish king, a Jew, a priest, and an imam. This is not a joke. This is actually his book in the 12th century. And in it, he has all of these different discussions between the rabbi and the priest and the imam and this king who's trying to figure out which religion he should convert to. It's a really interesting book for those that have never read it. And at one point, Judah Halevi is talking about why the Jewish people are so special. And he says, anybody who's part of the Jewish people, they are direct genetic descendants of people that go back to back to back to back to Mount Sinai and the Exodus from Egypt. To which the king obviously responds, well, hey, wait a minute. If I, who's a non-Jewish king of Khazar, converts, right, obviously my direct descendants do not go back to the Exodus from Egypt or Mount Sinai, to which Judah Halevi says in the book, you are correct. You are correct. If you convert, you're a part of the Jewish people. And then he says, without being quite equal to us, right? It's sort of the most shocking, not really anti, but, I'll call it anti-conversion statement probably in Jewish history before the last 150 years. We juxtapose that with Moses Maimonides, right? A, somewhat contemporary of Judah Halevi, who actually has this very famous letter to a convert. And in it, the convert asks a very simple halachic question, but oftentimes, great halachic questions throughout history really underlie much more philosophic phenomenon. And this convert, Ovadia, asks Maimonides, and he says, hey, every day in our prayers, right, if you open up the Siddur, the prayer book, most of our prayers say, God, the God of our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this convert asks a very simple question. He says, it seems like it would be a lie for me to usher this prayer every single day because the reality is my ancestors are not Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were, whichever ethnic group or tribal group I'm from. And Maimonides writes this very famous responsa that we saw some of it, I believe, in the first class. And he essentially, I'm going to overly simplify, says, you are just as much a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob as anybody else. And you should, of course, say this prayer. And you actually have a heightened reason to have, more intention during this prayer because for other people, it was sort of an accident of birth. And for you, you actually made the decision. And so Maimonides takes conversion from, Judah Halevi views conversion as almost as good, but clearly not as good because you're missing the ethnic component. Maimonides, who for Judaism was much more about coming to philosophic and moral truths, Maimonides places somebody who converts to Judaism or a Jew by choice actually above somebody who simply was born Jewish as sort of an accident of birth. And so we saw how this tension really plays out within Jewish sources. And much of this is obviously still around in the Jewish community today. Second class, we then flip the script. And, interestingly enough, when talking about Jewish identity, the first class we looked internally, right? How do Jews self-define ourselves? The second class, we looked at 3 case studies of anti-Semitism and how anti-Semitism has obviously flipped how Jews are seen. And so the first event that we saw really was the expulsion from Spain and subsequent Inquisition. And just to briefly summarize that, if you were to drop into a time machine in the year 1000, right? You can pick anywhere, whatever your favorite European country is, right? You went on vacation, you were a Jew in the year 1000 or 1100 or 1200, 99.9% of the time, if you went and asked somebody, right, somebody who wasn't Jewish, a Muslim or a Christian in one of the countries, how do you define Jews? They would say it's a religion, right? And how do we know that? Because over the course of medieval Jewish history, there had been many efforts to try to convert Jews to other faiths, right? Mostly Christianity, but there's also some cases of forced conversion to Islam. And for both Muslim and Christian rulers, if a Jew converted to either Islam or Christianity, they simply ceased to be Jewish, right? They just became Muslim or became Christian, right? All was good. Starting in the Inquisition, because of the mass numbers of Jews who were forcibly converted, and because of the debatably smaller, but nobody actually has any clue what percentage of Jews actually kept their internal identity as Jewish, right? What we might call Judeo-conversos, or no one uses this term anymore, but Marrano, which I actually didn't know this. I'll just give a 2-second sidebar. So Marrano in Spanish means swine, and it was a derogatory term for Jews who converted to Christianity externally, but internally remained Jewish. And the Christian word Marrano was actually derived from a midrash, right, in the Talmud, which talks about pigs. And one of the things that the rabbis in the Talmud say about pigs is that why are pigs sort of the epitome of not kosher? Because there's 2 things that an animal needs to be kosher, right? It needs to chew its cud and have split hooves. And one of those signs is external and one of them is internal, right? You can look at an animal and within a second you can tell if it has split hooves, but it requires, some degree in biology to understand if an animal chews its cud, right? Your average person can't walk up to a cow and see that it chews its cud and walk up to a horse and realize it doesn't, right? That requires a lot more knowledge. And pigs are one of the only animals that have split hooves, but don't chew its cud. And so the rabbis say the epitome of what a pig is externally they're, showing off to the world, hey, I'm kosher, but internally they're actually not kosher. So they're deceptive. And so the Christian authorities actually took that term and started applying it for Jews who were externally acting as Christians, but internally keeping their Jewish identity. It's a very interesting, stealing of the rabbinic tradition for an anti-Semitic purpose. But because of this, as we talked about in our last class, Jews started to be seen as not just a religion, but also an ethnicity. And the example that I gave is, let's say 1492 comes, and I decide it's better off for me and my family for me to convert to Christianity, right? It's simply not worth it to try to, be exiled somewhere and to wander away and to give away all, obviously when you left one of these countries, you didn't get to, spend time selling your house and, ask your job if you can transfer to the office in France, right? This was, you have to leave and all of your wealth and everything you own is sort of left there and it's going to be taken. And so this was a very difficult decision. And so let's say I decided, you know what, I'm just going to convert to Christianity. And let's say I didn't even intend to continue my internal Jewish identity. But the sort of, example that I gave last time is because I grew up Jewish, I've just never really had an appetite for pork, right? I don't know how to cook it. It's not part of any of my family recipes. I don't particularly crave it because I've never had it before, right? When I think of what a nice, weekend meal is, it's never pork. And so when I teach my kids how to cook, I just never teach them how to cook pork. And when they teach their kids how to cook, right, they just keep all the family recipes and they're never eating pork, right? Now let's say it's the year 1550. It's been 3 generations. Let's say my grandchildren don't even know they're Jewish, halachically. But they just happen to never eat pork because their parents never ate pork because their grandparents never ate pork. And one day, one of the things the Inquisition used to do is actually monitor the purchasing habits of people within Spain and Portugal, because a great way to catch if somebody was still a secret Jew was to see, well, who was still keeping Jewish law, aka who was not eating pork. And so all of a sudden they see that my grandchild is never eating pork. And so they show up to the door and say, you are under arrest by the Inquisition. We suspect you as being Jewish. Now, that suspicion is not based off of anything religious, right? It's based off of an ethnic background of them knowing their grandfather happened to be Jewish. And over time, this began to morph Jewish identity within wider Europe from people seeing Jews as a religious group to people seeing Jews as a ethnic group. Then, during the French Revolution and Jewish modernity, the exact opposite thing happens, right? It's I can't overemphasize enough how important this switch ends up being and why it has endlessly confused Jewish identity, and also, I'll argue, the definition of anti-Semitism for the last many hundred years. Because during emancipation in the late 1700s, early 1800s, the different nation states of France, of Germany, later on Italy, one can argue a little bit culturally in America, people were making the exact opposite argument. They were saying, if Jews want to be a part of these new nation states and receive all the equality of citizens in, say, France, then Jews have to give up their national identity, and Jews can be a religious group called Jews, right, with no national aspirations, with none of these, weird tendencies that come with the, national aspects of Judaism. And so in modern Europe, right, and modern I mean 1800s, the definition of Judaism flipped back to Jews are a religion. And so in the 1500s, Jews became an ethnicity. In the 1800s, Europe, you're right, externally, Jews became a religion. And obviously, throughout the late 1800s, early 1900s, anti-Semitism morphed to be both attacking Jews for our religious identity and attacking Jews for our ethnic identity. And these days, it's almost impossible to figure out which is which, right? If you see somebody who's anti-Semitic, are they doing it because they're against the ethnic identity of Jews or against the religious identity of Jews and what Jews believe? It's very difficult to actually figure out. And that gets us to the very last chapter in our story. And I'll just share my screen and we'll, talk for a few minutes about this. And then I'm happy to, I think, sorry, I'm just trying to figure out permission here. Okay, there we go. We'll go through a couple of slides, and then again, I want this last class to be a little bit more interactive because, as I said at the outset, the only honest answer to this question of who are Jews today is it depends who you ask. But hopefully through this journey, we've been able to see why it depends on who you ask. Because both within Jewish tradition, in terms of how the Tanakh and the Talmud and our great medieval rabbis understand Jewish identity, and how Jews have been defined by the non-Jewish mainstream, there's good reason to be confused about this question. This is not the type of question that if anybody offers you a simple solution, you should probably be skeptical and run away from their, narrow definition of Jewish identity. So just to review a couple things that are for sure going to be reviewed, and then we'll dive headfirst into, I think, this very interesting last chapter of Jewish history. So just to rebuild the building blocks from step one, Theodor Herzl in the late 1800s puts forth his great political Zionist manifesto, where he essentially was arguing for a state for the Jews. And the wording is important here. Herzl very explicitly does not talk about Judaism. When Herzl talks about Jews, Herzl is talking about a form of anti-Semitism that's happening in Western Europe that is almost entirely targeting Jews, not because of some religious aspect of Jews, but because of the ethnic, or what we might later call genetic aspect of Jews. Some scholars say Theodor Herzl in some way was able to predict Nazi Germany 40 years before anybody else, right? That was one of the genius aspects of Herzl. You can't read Herzl now. Herzl's writing in the 1890s. It's impossible to read Herzl now without thinking of the Holocaust and just how correct he was when he was talking about what would eventually happen in Western Europe. But so Herzl essentially argues what Jews need to be safe is a state that can protect the lives of ethnic Jews, right? How do we know that Herzl didn't care about Judaism? Because Herzl himself wrote that he was an atheist. He did not care about Judaism. He actually, earlier on in his life, tried to assimilate into wider Western European culture. And Herzl only flipped and became a quote unquote Zionist when Herzl realized, oh, wait a minute, it doesn't matter how much me as a Jew tries to assimilate. Eventually, when, stuff happens, right? In his case, it was the Dreyfus affairs, but when some, societal chaos happens, they're going to come for the Jews. And it doesn't make a difference if you are ultra-Orthodox or Reform or conservative or completely atheistic or even attempt to convert to Christianity, right? Herzl actually at some point entertained the idea of maybe Jews should just convert to Christianity, as did many Jewish intellectuals in the 1800s. But even that, Herzl said, right, they're going to be able to figure out who is Jewish. And so Herzl puts forth his platform of Jews need a state that can physically protect the lives of Jews, right? So Herzl cared about ethnic Jewish identity. Enter in Achad Ha'am, Asher Ginsburg, a contemporary of Herzl, and Achad Ha'am writes a very famous reaction to the first Zionist Congress, where he hears Herzl put forth his platform, and Achad Ha'am essentially creates what we now today call cultural Zionism, where Achad Ha'am essentially argues it's not just the Jews who are in trouble. It's not just anti-Semitism that is going to be the downfall of Jews in the world. It's also Judaism. It's also, you can't disconnect, in Achad Ha'am's words, the culture of Judaism from the ethnicity of being Jewish, right? What Herzl was trying to do is say, well, there's Jews, and then there's this thing called Judaism that some Jews carry around with them, but, most of us have left that behind, and so all we really care about is Jews, right? Achad Ha'am is saying that is impossible differentiation to make, right? If we are going to create a state, this state has to be, in the words of Achad Ha'am, not just a state for the Jews, but a Jewish state. In other words, this needs to be a country that has Jewish culture within the mainstream. Now, this starts a nice 125-year debate that Israel is arguably still having of, well, what does it mean for Israel to have Jewish flavor, right? The Herzl answer is very easy. Right? If you ask Herzl, what does it mean for a state to be Jewish? What Herzl would say is, this is a state that protects ethnic Jews, right? What does that mean? Well, one, that means, we'll talk in a minute about the right of return. If any Jew is in trouble anywhere in the world and wants to immigrate to Israel, of course, Israel is waiting with open doors. Herzl might even go further and say, some of these incredible missions that Israel did in the 1950s and 60s, and then some recent ones in the 90s, where Israel actually went and rescued Jews from places like Yemen and Ethiopia and Iraq and all these different missions to try to, again, save Jews that are in trouble around the world, right? That's also part of Israel's mission, because these are ethnic Jews in trouble, right? Achad Ha'am's definition is a little bit harder to conceive of, right? What does it mean for a country to have Jewish culture within its mainstream? So here are a couple of options, and then perhaps at the end of class we can discuss this a little bit more. One option is to say, kind of like America is not necessarily a religious Christian state, although, one can debate the merits of that statement, but it certainly is a culturally Christian state. What do I mean by that? We all know we're getting Christmas off for the next, 100 years, right? Every year, December 25th, right? That is a national holiday, even though it's a religious holiday, right? In America, it's collapsed. So perhaps with Israel, we should just do that for Jewish holidays, right? So as opposed to every year we know that Christmas is off, every year the entire month of October, because we know Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Shmini Atzeret, right? Okay, we'll just give everybody 3 weeks off in the middle of October, and that will be the sort of Israeli equivalent of what it means to be a cultural state, right? So that's one definition, right? Just like, just to continue this definition, just like if you go to many national cemeteries in America, you see a bunch of giant crosses that are paid for by taxpayer money. And if you go through many, downtown areas during holiday season, you see many giant Christmas trees that are paid for by taxpayer money, right? Again, it's very hard to say, is this religiously Christian? Is this culturally Christian, right? It's not a very clear boundary. So with Israel, it's the same thing, right? Taxpayer money pays for giant menorahs everywhere in the public sphere, right? So this is one definition of what it means for Israel to be a Jewish state. Another, which was taken by some early religious Zionists, right, Abraham Isaac Cook, most notably, is this is a state that should actually push a adherence to halakha or Jewish law, right? This is a very different definition of what it means to be a Jewish state than culturally, right? Culturally, what it means to be a Jewish state is that you say, well, maybe Passover, right, during the days of the Seder, right, the Chag days, right, that should be a national day off, right? That's the cultural definition. The religious definition would say not only should Passover be a day off, it should actually be illegal if, say, Susan owns a public institution, or if Susan works at a hospital, or if Susan is commanding an IDF base, or any national institution. Susan has to, by the force of law, actually provide kosher for Passover food for everybody in the hospital system, right? This actually was a major debate in Israel a few years ago about whether or not hospitals can serve non-kosher for Passover food, right? So that's another definition of what that means, right? That's going a little bit beyond the cultural. So just to reiterate, we have these three definitions of what a Jewish state might be, and these are debates that were originating really in the 1890s and still very hot debates today, right? Is Israel an ethnic Jewish state? Is Israel a culturally Jewish state? Or is Israel a religiously Jewish state? Now, of course, what Israel does is, Jews don't like to make anything easy. So Israel says, well, we'll take some of each. So Israel, in its laws, both starting with its Declaration of Independence and then in its national laws that it passes, Israel has no constitution, so Israel has sort of national laws that it passes every couple of years. Israel has components of all three: ethnic, cultural, and religious. So just to unpack this a little bit throughout the history and how it affects this important debate. So in the 1950s, right, this is just going to be, 7 minutes of history, and then we'll talk about the repercussions here, and then we'll take some questions. In 1950, one of the first major legislation that Israel passed is the law of return. Any Jew around the world is able to obtain citizenship. At this time, there were hundreds of thousands of Jews that were still in DP camps after World War II. There were also almost a million, right, several hundreds of thousands of Jews living in the Arab world who, after 1948, their life became immediately in trouble because they were suspected of, quote unquote, collaborating with the Zionist state. This happened almost throughout the entire Arab world. And so Israel passed this law, 1950, right of return. Any Jew can obtain citizenship. And so just to see a quote from David Ben-Gurion here, he says, this law does not provide for the state to bestow the right to settle upon the Jew living abroad, right? This is very interesting language, right? Ben-Gurion is saying, right, this 1950 law does not give Israel the ability to bestow the right? So if I'm a Jew, like, let's just use me as an example. I'm a Jew living in Orange County. I am not an Israeli citizen. So David Ben-Gurion is saying this 1950s law is not saying that Israel has the ability to give me the right to immigrate to Israel, right? Listen to his words. He says, it affirms that this right is inherent in him from the very fact of being a Jew. The state does not grant the right of return to the Jews of the diaspora. The right preceded the state. This right built the state. Its source is to be found in the historic and never broken connection between the Jewish people and the homeland. So what David Ben-Gurion is saying with this passing of, this was his speech when this law was passed through the Israeli parliament or Knesset, he's saying, right, this isn't even, right, an aspect of the Israeli nation state of a right that it has to give other Jews the right to immigrate. This is inherent within the very nature of Israel, within the very fabric of Israel, that every Jew has an inherent right to go to the land of Israel because of our unbroken connection, right? This is all very well and good, but this, of course, prompts the question that, we're all here to discuss, which is, well, who gets to decide who and what is a Jew, right? We still have not solved that problem. And this has turned out to be one of the most contentious and, I would argue, interesting questions within the Israeli legal system over the last 70 years. So let's look at a couple of interesting Supreme Court cases about this law. So starting in 1962, there was a famous case with a man named Oswald Rousseffen, who was a Jew who was born in a Jewish village, fully Jewish, in Poland, who during the years of the Holocaust hid out in a Christian covenant and became so inspired by what he saw there, he actually converted to Catholicism and became a monk, right? A fascinating historic episode, and this was actually not unique, right? I don't want to overestimate the number of people who did this, but there's a lot of evidence that maybe in the thousands, Jews who spent the years during the Holocaust hiding out in various Christian institutions, and some of whom after the Holocaust ended up, returning to Judaism, but many just kept their Christian identity and lived the rest of their life as Christians. Now, most of those people, right, ended up being more than happy to spend the rest of their lives either in Europe or some came to America. Very few ever had the idea of, maybe I should now move to Israel. But Brother Daniel, as he was known, puts in 1962 to the Israeli government and says, hey, I'm Jewish, right? My parents were both Jewish. I am fully ethnically Jewish. I want to immigrate to the land of Israel. The Israeli Supreme Court, which at this time, right, just to back up for a second, in 1962, Israel was much more secular of a country than it is now. We'll get to this in a little bit. But there were almost zero religious minds on the Supreme Court in 1962. This is going to be important in a second. And the Supreme Court looks at Brother Daniel's case. It looks at the definition of the right of return, which at that point was very vague, right? It just says Jews have a right to immigrate to Israel, which the precedent in the 1950s was using somewhat of a mixture of Hitler's Nuremberg laws and also a bunch of, subjective aspects of definition, but we'll talk about that in about 5 minutes. The Supreme Court looks at Brother Daniel's case and it rejects him. It says, you are not eligible to come to Israel because you are no longer Jewish, right? Just to look at the quote, the Israeli Supreme Court in their majority briefing, there was also a minority opinion that said, yes, he should be able to immigrate, but the majority opinion says he does not meet popular definition of Jewishness. In other words, if Brother Daniel, dressed in his Catholic garb, shows up to one of our Jewish institutions, shows up to synagogue, right, and asks, hey, I would love to receive an aliyah, or, can you please count me, in your community as a Jew, right? What the Israeli Supreme Court is arguing is, well, popular definition would say, well, you're not really Jewish. Even though, right, what we all know, both halachically and ethnically, he is Jewish. So one of the ironies of the Brother Daniel case, and we can talk about how this ended up switching the definition within the Israeli mainstream, is had Brother Daniel then gone to the Rabbanut, right, the ultra-Orthodox wing of the Israeli government, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, and said, hey, I really want to immigrate to Israel, I guess I need to convert back to Judaism, they would look at him and say, well, you've never stopped being Jewish. Because as we saw in class number 1, most, if not all, medieval Jewish legal authorities, right, had this exact case happen, right? Starting with the Crusades, medieval Jews were placed many times in situations where they were forcibly converted to Christianity or converted to Christianity in order to save their life, right? It doesn't make a difference if this was 1096 in some French or German village during the Crusades or during the Holocaust. Most medieval rabbis said a Jew, even who converts to Christianity, is still seen as Jewish, right? And if they want to come back to the Jewish community, they obviously need to do teshuvah, right? The same way that if a Jew, I don't know, eats pork on Yom Kippur, right? They don't stop being Jewish, right? They would still, if they want to be reaccepted into the mainstream, they'd probably need to issue some apology for, doing that, right? We call that teshuvah, but we would never say, if we catch somebody eating pork on Yom Kippur, we would never say, you're not Jewish, you're eating pork on Yom Kippur, right? We might say you're not following Jewish law, right? If we want to moralize, we might say you're being a bad Jew, right? But a bad Jew is still a Jew. And this is how most medieval rabbis saw Jews who converted to Christianity. They were bad Jews. And so Brother Daniel would be seen as a quote unquote bad Jew by the ultra-Orthodox authority. Yet the irony is that for the secular Israeli Supreme Court, who were going mostly off of, again, the secularized, modern, right, I would argue more sociologic definition of what it means to be Jewish, a Jew who converts to Christianity is no longer Jewish. For halachically observant Jews, right, the ultra-Orthodox Rabbanut in Israel, they would say, well, you can't stop being Jewish. So people like Brother Daniel should be able to convert to Judaism, should be able to immigrate to Israel and don't need to convert. And this is exactly what the minority opinion in the Supreme Court case ends up arguing. So you have this fascinating case in Israel, which again takes our question, which in the medieval period was mostly theoretical in the Jewish community, right? Even people who adopted Judah Halevi's approach of, well, there's something, or Ezra's approach of, there's something unique about, the Jewish seed. I can promise you Judah Halevi would never treat somebody who converted to Judaism differently than somebody who was born an ethnic Jew, even if, according to his philosophy, he felt that they were on some different metaphysical levels, right? That never actually got down to the level of, well, how does that actually affect life? Because of the state of Israel and the right of return passed in the 1950s, all of a sudden, this theoretical question begins to have very real consequences for Jews around the world, because now the question of who is a Jew is not this interesting academic question. This is the difference between being able to immigrate to Israel or not being able to immigrate to Israel. To make matters a little bit more complex, I'll say one more thing and then we'll take questions before the next Supreme Court case. Israel internally actually bifurcates this question. And what I mean by that, and I think this has been covered in other ALI classes, so I don't want to dwell too much on this, but Israel actually has two different parts of its government that has two different definitions of what it means to be Jewish. One is the external definition, or the general governmental definition, and that is the wing of the government that is in charge of the right of return, right? So if any of us applies to immigrate and make aliyah and become an Israeli citizen, that case is going to be handled by the mainstream Israeli government, right? If it's a controversial case, maybe it'll be kicked up to the Supreme Court, but that is within the normative judicial system of Israel. On the other hand, say you immigrate to Israel, you become an Israeli citizen, and then you want to get married, or then you want to adopt somebody, or then you want to even have yourself registered in, Israel's Bureau of Statistics as somebody who's Jewish. All of a sudden you get funneled through a different definition of Jewish identity, and that is the definition of the Rabbanut, right? The 2-second history, which I'm sure everybody here is familiar with, is in 1948 or 1947. David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, makes a deal with the small ultra-Orthodox community that was in British Mandate Palestine at the time. This ultra-Orthodox group did not want to adopt Zionism, and they were very against what David Ben-Gurion and his secular Zionist, comrades, right? They were all socialists, were trying to accomplish in terms of creating a state. And Ben-Gurion correctly understood that it would be very difficult for the UN to vote to create the state of Israel if the most, I'll paraphrase Ben-Gurion's words, the most Jewish-looking Jews, right? The ultra-Orthodox Jews are all of a sudden standing there saying, actually, we don't want this, right? That would be very bad for, PR to try to get countries to vote for having a Jewish state. So Ben-Gurion met with the Chazon Ish, the head of the ultra-Orthodox community at the time, and he said, if you encourage the Haredi community, the ultra-Orthodox community, to be on board with the Israeli state, I will give you control over certain elements of public life. And what elements of public life was that, right? Most importantly, this was marriage, divorce, adoption, right? Family life. And so today, if you were to go to Israel, let's say tomorrow I decided, I want to make aliyah. My case, in terms of if I was Jewish, would be processed by the secular Israeli government. They would say, do I fit the secular definition of right of return that Israel passed in 1950 that ends up being tweaked during all these Supreme Court cases? If so, great, I can immigrate to Israel. Let's say then I get to Israel and then I want to get married in Israel, right? Then I go through an entirely different process through the ultra-Orthodox Rabbanut, where they say, am I halachically Jewish according to an Orthodox Jewish perspective, right? That can be, as talked about before, very different than the secular Jewish perspective. And so that is a little piece of background that's going to be important for the next case. Before I go there, I'll take a minute or two for any questions here. Yeah, go for it, Rap.
Yeah, can I ask? I wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, please.
So, if the brother, the monk, had moved to Israel in the Christian community, he could become a citizen of Israel. Right. Once he's a citizen of Israel, could he then go to the Supreme Court and do the thing that this is just speculation, that he's already a citizen? And so could he have jumped over the line of separation and become a Jewish member, a citizen of Israel?
Yeah, as inherently, yes. Just to go through one just general background, somebody who isn't Jewish can immigrate to Israel. It's just very difficult, right? The same way, I mean, anybody can become an American citizen. It's just a very long, laborious process that takes, many years if you want to do it right. So if you're an American Christian or a Polish Christian, it is possible for you to immigrate to Israel and to become a citizen as a Christian. It just, you have to go through all the red tape and bureaucracy. And maybe it takes 10 years, right? The interesting aspect of right of return is that it's immediate. I mean, any one of us who fits the definition of right of return, by the end of Monday, right, by the end of today, by the end of the workday, we can be essentially greenlit on the path to receiving Israeli citizenship and be on a plane. I mean, right now, I think Israel's canceled flights to Israel, but the second that El Al, has flights going back to Ben Gurion Airport, you can be on that plane and they can say, welcome home, and you are now a citizen, right? There might be some forms you have to sign, but that happens almost instantaneous. If somebody like Brother Daniel, say, he went through that 10-year process and became a citizen, right, as a Christian, and then wanted to get married, he would actually face an additional hurdle in Israel, because the ultra-Orthodox court would argue, well, he actually has to get married through the ultra-Orthodox rabbinut. So it would actually be difficult for him, if he was in Israel, to actually marry somebody who was Christian, right? And we can talk about some interesting loopholes on that. But yeah, it's a great question. Any other questions on these fun Supreme Court cases? Yeah, go for it, Chuck.
Rabbi,
You
I have
answered
a
the
question about how does Israel itself, the nation of Israel, changes the Jewish identity between that, you kept talking between between ethnicity and a religion. I remember my dad, he grew up before there was an Israel. And he said, we were just a religion back then. He said, with Israel, it changes everything, the Jewish people. He felt that the way we saw ourselves, both as a nation, even though you didn't live there, and as a religion. It was completely different, he said, without Israel, as being there, as to who we are. And even now, what we have seen over the last year with the protests on campus, like Zionists, what is a Zionist and who is a Zionist, and Jewish groups being attacked, does the world view us differently because we have the nation of Israel?
The screen is off, Daniel.
Whoops, it was such a good question. My internet cut out. It's a really good question. Sorry for the 2-second cut out there. So that inherently is part of this problem that arguably, this might be a little bit of an oversimplification, but I don't think it is. The secular aspect of Israel, right? The Supreme Court, the Knesset, most of the judicial process sees Judaism as a nation, right? And this means that the definition of Jewish identity has to be a nationalistic one, so that if I do not identify as Jewish subjectively, right? If I say I convert to Christianity and I'm no longer Jewish, for the nation side of Israel, it doesn't make a difference if I'm ethnically or religiously Jewish. They say I'm not a part of the Jewish nation, right? I'm not nationally Jewish, right? This is a little bit conflicted because obviously there's 20% of Israel is not is not Jewish, right? They're Arab, they're Christian, and they're also a little bit